I don't think the solution is simple. I think the solution is not simple because it goes about changing people's behavior and the way they manage natural resources, of poor people in villages over vast areas of land, 45% of the world's land. And to change, traditional people's behavior is not something very easy. On top of it, we have the climate change impact. Who in fact, like we see here in Namibia, where they had a very long drought again, and now today it starts raining. So it is a convention that in fact goes to the heart of poverty reduction, and that is not an easy thing to eradicate. So that I think it's an issue. Why it doesn't get so much attention, I think mainly because it's about poor people. It's about degraded land. It's not about big cities. It's not about industry. It's not about, it could be, of course, more bit industry if you link it with extractive industries. But it's the convention of the poor man. And, as you really know, the poor man has not a big political power, and therefore I think it receives much less attention. And I hope that this one day will turn and that people will realize the critical importance of restoring violence. You are right in your assessment that in fact we know what to do. There is a lot of good research, including, by UNDP, a lot of practical experience on the ground that can help us restore degraded land. There are excellent examples in China, also here, for example, in Namibia, how we really can work with different stakeholders to revert this trend. So it's not impossible, but it takes time, it takes money, and it takes dedication and political will. And I think time there is, by definition. There is certainly not a lot of financing for the desertification convention, and there is not a lot of political will to really address it.
One of the key parts of the Rio Plus 20 summit and the Future We Want document. I haven't read it all. I'm not sure anyone has, but you have. But was that concept of green growth and sustainable growth? What responsibility do you feel major corporations have to ensure that when they buy farmlands in Africa or Asia or around the world, and when they invest in those areas, they don't degrade the land, use as much as they can, and then move on? Because that seems to be an increasingly relevant part of these talks, the idea that big companies are coming in, buying land for cheap, exploiting it, and moving on.
It's unluckily the real situation. The issue is, of course, companies, except for some few, are there for profit, and we should not forget this one. Companies will behave in a more sustainable way if the enabling environment is such that they are obliged to behave in a more sustainable way. So I think it's really important, and there the convention comes in, that the governments set the regulatory and legislatory framework, including with the monitoring, to make companies move and invest differently. And that is really the way we move. We cannot solve the world's environmental degradation problem by governments. It's really the big companies, like you rightly say, who come buy up farmland, buy up mining areas, or do the mining, that have to change their behavior. I'm not naive. I don't think that companies will ever change their behavior except if there is a legislative framework around them that make them change. On the other hand, in the positive term, knowing the impact of climate change, knowing the environmental pollution we have, many companies are in fact taking already more action than many of the governments. And so you have quite a number of enlightened CEOs of major companies that realize for the long-term benefit of the company themselves, they have to start behaving much more sustainable. They just cannot come in, take out the resources and run away. If they're going to do this one day, the local population will stand up and say, listen, what are you doing with our resources? If they degrade the land, it will become more and more and more expensive, to get the profit from the land. So I think that we are in a very interesting time where in fact, yes, a number of companies are behaving more sustainable. I think the global reporting initiative from the Secretary General, where companies are obliged to report on their sustainability, is very important. Transparency of companies, really showing them how they do with energy, how they do with land, is really important. And that's where you people in the media have such an important role to play. But if there is no pressure from the consumer, if there is no pressure from the government, then it's difficult for companies to change. But there is a growing awareness, so it's a little bit a double balance.
What role can the UN, what role can leading voices like Ban Ki-moon play in putting pressure on companies? Is that a national issue? Is that for regional blocs like the EU to do it?
I think increasingly over the years I have served the UN, I have really seen more and more initiatives where indeed, the UN is also working with major companies. I can give you a number of examples. The UN has the Global Compact, which has many of the major companies and has introduced social and environmental reporting in big company systems. UNDP, for example, has a financial initiative which works with major banks, pension funds to really incorporate sustainability in their work. UNDP has a whole division that works with the private sector, trying to work with the private sector to change their behavior, to give them information. We are now starting a major program on extractive industries because this is so important, for the poor people again, trying to set rules and regulations, remittances, social and environmental safeguards. So the UN as such works increasingly, with companies. Of course, we serve governments. Our first client is governments, but we also have to make sure that the governments have the tools and the companies have the knowledge to move to a more sustainable and equitable world.
I watched a fascinating film last night hosted by the UNCCD. It was called The Man Who Stopped the Desert, about a Burkina Faso farmer called Yakuba, who's actually walking around here dispensing his knowledge. One of the fascinating bits about that was that he without any help from the government and without really any help, I think, from regional authorities, managed to change a vast area of farmland himself. It didn't cost very much, and it came from those kind of grassroots. How can the UN and how can governments get to those grassroots? Because so often we see funding, it goes in, to the top through regional development, and that money doesn't always seem to trickle down. I'm not sort of saying none of it trickles down, but how can we get right to those grassroots?
No, that's a good question, and in fact I was addressing it in my presentation the other day in plenary. Because indeed, an organization like UNCCD or even UNDP, we cannot be with all the communities, with all the grassroots. There are far too many. So the name of the game is to identify some good projects or some good examples, and then using our political clout to scale them up. And for example, my colleague who is also here, who is working with the Equator Initiative. The Equator Initiative, which is a UNDP program, which is exactly doing this one. We give prizes to people like the men from Burkina Faso, and then bring them to the UN, bring them to heads of states, and in front of the heads of states, let them tell their stories. We had, for example, in Vietnam, where there was a woman working with bamboo and reintroducing bamboo. The president of Vietnam took her from New York back to Hanoi in his personal plane. And this is then how you can really make policymakers aware that indeed change is possible, even for their voters. And so this is one of these initiatives which I really think links local action with global attention. It has a lot also to do with influencing conventions, because you bring the reality of the ground to the global policy setting and to the national policy setting. Another very good example is the small grants program of the GAF which UNDP is implementing, which again is the same. This is about small grants, 20,000, 50,000, 100,000, but which goes directly from the global level, from the donor, to the people on the ground. And then it's owned by the national governments, so the national governments, they themselves select it. So it's not top-down, it's grassroots. There are quite a number of these initiatives in the UN, and I think what we need to do is build on these ones, give them more prominence, make sure that people like you, like the media knows about it, report about it, so that you really can support. Because at the end of the day, there is only one good custodian of the natural resources, is the farmer who lives on these resources.
And on a final point, in terms of the Ban Ki-moon talked at his opening at the General Assembly about 2015 being an absolutely critical year on any number of different levels. One of those is perhaps the establishment of the Sustainable Development Goals. Land degradation has to be in there somewhere, doesn't it? I mean, would it not be absurd if it is not one of those goals?
Well, I'm the co-chair of the technical support team that supports the Open Working Group, so I'm involved in these goals day by day. I think we should be also realistic. It's, in my feeling, and seeing how many goals there are, and there are more than 250 goals being proposed now from everything, from poverty to maternal health, to agriculture. I think it looks at this moment rather not realistic to expect that one of the 10 goals will be, just on land degradation. because people want it on mountains, people want biodiversity, people want on oceans. Everybody is lobbying for their specific goal. I think what the land degradation community should do is take a very realistic and pragmatic approach and make sure that in some of the targets, 10 goals, maybe 60 targets, but in some of the targets, indeed, there are indicators included that address issues of land degradation. Land is extremely important for food security. Land is extremely important for poverty reduction. Land is extremely important for water management. Land is extremely important for gender equality. So I think the name of the game will be, as the system develops, to make sure that maybe we have in the whole system of 10 goals, 60 targets, and then a number of indicators, a good system that will oblige governments, private sector, civil society to monitor a number of indicators that are directly related to land degradation. And then I think we have something much bigger than trying to put all our energy in trying to have a goal, while in fact you're competing against so many other goals.